do my thing, and that'll then be followed by John. And hopefully we've got some time for discussion and thinking. Right, the theme of today is architectural interest and aesthetic value. So next one, please. Just a quick word, welcome from our committee. In terms of future sessions, we've got one on the 20th of November, which is Tim Meek talking about line finishes, an archaeological scientific approach to understanding the significance of line coats. And we've got the AGM on the 10th of December. We've got another tea break session, 5th of February on setting. And we have another evening lecture on the 19th of February. And we're planning a church recording day in the spring of 2026 and a joint landscape and buildings SIG in sort of around the spring as well. It would be good to try and fit in some other lunchtime lectures, but I know it's these things sometimes are not so easy to fix. So it would be quite nice to arrange a couple of other lunchtime lectures, because I think what we're going to be talking about today might just sort of set out a few hairs running, really. So the next slide. Okay, we're all familiar with the significance-based approach, how we protect and enhance what really matters about a heritage asset. And of course, the planning policy sets out significance derives from heritage interests, be they archaeological, historic, or architectural and artistic. NPPF and NPS, of course, don't define those terms other than archaeological interests. So the next one. Oh, next slide. Yeah. What we really want to talk about is how interest and values intersect, and in particular, the issue of architectural artistic interest, what in conservation principles is called aesthetic value, that we're all familiar with, and those broadly align. But I think there's a lot of intersection between aesthetic value. I'm going to talk about aesthetic value because it's a shorthand for talking about architectural interest. Otherwise, we'll use up a lot of the time. And there's a lot of intersection between aesthetic value, historical value, evidential value, and of course, what there is there in conservation principles as a communal value, or what the National Trust would call people value. We talked in a previous session about Monk's house in Rodmell, which is Virginia Woolf's house. And you can just see there how, in a summation, the aesthetic value, of course, it illustrates the taste and design philosophy of Virginia Woolf, but that builds off the evidence of the fabric itself, how the fabric was altered for Virginia and Leonard Woolf, and in turn, its associations with the Woolfs, the Bloomsbury Group, with Leonard Woolf, and illustrating 17th to 19th century domestic life. Next slide. What I'm going to be really focusing on in the next 15 minutes really is this issue of how, of course, aesthetic value is quite strongly related perhaps to how we look at landscape. And here we have John Constable's painting of Dedham Vale in flood, painted in 1814, looking towards the church at Dedham, across the flooded meadows of the Stour Valley. And we have a useful definition of landscape in the European Landscape Convention, an area as perceived by people, whose character is the result, the action interaction of natural and or human factors. So landscape is doubly cultural, if you like. So both perceptual and also the result of action interaction of people and nature over hundreds and thousands of years. The NPPF talks about the value of a heritage asset to this and future generations because of its heritage interest. The interest may be archaeological, artistic, or historic. Significance deriving from setting. Conservation principles is more specific about aesthetic value, about how people draw sensory and intellectual stimulation from a place, from views in the landscape. and that results from how places have been designed for particular purposes and have developed over time, of course. So we're looking here at a landscape that has a rich archaeological legacy, albeit one that's been scraped down by successive generations of agricultural use. There are evidence for Bronze Age ring barrows around the Stour Valley, and the development of a settled landscape in the late Saxon period, the establishment of Dedham by the 10th century, and so on. But of course, this is the landscape that was where John Constable grew up, and which he loved, and which he described and sought to characterize through his art. So next slide. Constable also touches on a definition of, if you like, of England, of English culture, that was sort of quite neatly encapsulated by J.B. Priestley in his English Journey, written between the wars. The old country, the country of cathedrals and minsters and manor houses and inns, a country to lounge about in for a tourist. The New England of cinemas and dance halls and cafes, etc. One can include Lido's, as in the centre there at Saltdean Lido. And of course, industrial England, coal, iron, steel, cotton, wool, railways, etc. And we start to get onto a rather more controversial definition of industrial England, perhaps a cynically devastated countryside, sooty, dismal little towns, and still sootier, grim, fortress-like towns. There's Sunny Brow at Willington in County Durham. Right, next slide. Right, we're going to talk about Flatford. And Flatford, which is where the Constable family had their mill. Constable grew up in the nearby village of East Bergold. His house was demolished soon after the family sold the house. And it's at Flatford where we have so many of the buildings and set within a landscape context that relate to Constable's art. So in terms of evidential value, the historic buildings are a remarkably intact grouping. We've got two late medieval farmhouses. We've got the substantial mill of the 1750s. We've got the granary of the late 18th century, and then sort of working towards the bottom of the photograph, Bridge Cottage, next to the Stour navigation. The Stour navigation being an improvement of the navigability of the Stour River that had declined from the late medieval period. And navigation being established in the early 18th century, in which the constables played a very significant role. And this is a landscape that had changed hugely from the late medieval period. A lot of change to the agricultural landscape, which is happening during Constable's time. And in terms of historical interest, this landscape, it illustrates to a unique degree Constable's influence on British and European art. The landscape and the buildings actually illustrate that, because that's what Constable was depicting and painting and writing about. And indeed, the whole of the Dedham Vale serves as an essential guide in understanding how Constable sought to demonstrate the landscape painting was no longer subservient to historical painting, picking up on the Dutch masters and so on. He was wanting to paint truth to nature, beginning to work towards more abstract styles that actually were hugely significant in the development of the Barbizon school around Fontainebleau, and by Camille Corot and his realistic paintings of rural labour, and through him of Impressionism. The Haywain and View on the Stour near Dedham were enthusiastically received at the Paris Salon of 1824, less so in England. So next slide. When we start to look at aesthetic value here, it's easy enough to look at places where Constable painted, which is what I've done for the Stour Valley as a whole, but this is just looking at Flatford, looking at viewpoints, how viewpoints have changed, and so on. in terms of aesthetic value. It so clearly evokes how a specific place was inspired and continued to shape the work of an artist of world renown. The concentration of so many of Constable's works in this area was fundamental to the prominence it had in the national imagination in the later 19th century. What's really important to stress here is that after Constable's death in 1837, his fame really increased. People already were talking about Constable country in the 1830s, but it was the publication of Leslie's memoirs of Constable's life in the 1840s that was a bestseller, went through lots of print runs and editions. The Hay Wain was enthusiastically brought to the back to the National Gallery from France in 1884. There was applause in the House of Commons. We have the Constable family giving works of their father to the National Gallery and to the South Kensington Museum, now the V&A. By the 1820s, we've got Thomas Cook arranging tours of Constable country. We have the fame of Constable country drawing in other artists like Sir Arthur Munnings, John Nash, Cedric Morris of the East Anglian School of Painting and Drawing. And we have as the last point is really highlighting that by the 1920s, we have the more and more people sort of focusing their efforts on how to conserve Flatford, because what Constable was depicting was an industrial settlement in many respects. It was an inland navigable port, and around it there was an agricultural landscape that had been through a lot of change in the 18th and early 19th centuries, with the realignment of hedgerows, the taking out of older pollard trees and so on. It was a businessman, Parkington, who was preeminent in saving Flatford Mill and Willie Lott's Cottage, and ensuring that after his death they would be donated to the National Trust. There was a book called The Saving of Flatford Mill, which included an extract from Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's address to the Royal Society of Arts. Nothing is more characteristic of England's countryside than the cottage homes, which have sheltered her sturdy sons of toil. They're part of our country, part of our inheritance, part of our national life. Ought we not then to be proud of them, to protect them? And he was quoted at length by Herbert Cornish in his book on Constable country, which was really talking about East Burgold and Flatford as the mother place in English-speaking peoples. England is the country, and the country is England, stated Baldwin. And it was Flatford that Flatford Mill was acquired in September 1943, on the same day actually as the British Army took Salerno, as it was given to the Field Studies Council, who were the world's first field studies centre, and the sentiment underpinning that was a belief that there had to be, as Flatford was ideal as an iconic place for the study of natural history. The majority of our people live in towns, though we've evidence enough that the love of the countryside and indeed of nature is a deep-seated English trait and a genuine characteristic of our culture, our art, our literature, and our natural science at their best. So you can see there how Flatford sort of developed as this icon. And there's Willie Lott's Cottage with the Hay Wain above it. Next slide. So it's prominent in terms of its aesthetic value and really intertwined with its historical value. It's its prominence as a place of national and international pilgrimage. It also becomes, after the war in particular, becomes more important as an icon of contested Englishness. Here is Peter Kennard's The Hay Wain with cruise missiles. Next slide. So when we're looking at specific buildings within Flatford Mill is very well preserved externally. It's the most complete of the mid-18th century and later brick mills and mill groups along the Stour. But it also has within it significant evidence for how it was altered in the 1920s. There was a staircase inserted, the rooms were opened out, all the machinery, all the mill machinery was taken out, quite a lot of the internal structure was removed in order to kind of restore it in as to an aesthetic idea, if you like, matching Constable's art. It's one of the most strongly represented buildings in the art of Constable, becoming an icon of English identity, as we've seen. The association with the Field Studies Council. It's has such a strong sort of association with Constable's art. In terms of its communal value or people value, it's has national, international value as a well-known subject of Constable's art, a place of pilgrimage. Right, next slide. And here is Bridge Cottage, next to the next to one of the dry docks where barges were restored and built as depicted by Constable. And here's a view of Bridge Cottage from the lock. Of course, that view is that lock was reconstructed, but not on its original position. You know, Bridge Cottage survives. The landscape around it has changed quite a bit, but again, all the effort was put in the 1920s, 1930s to ensuring that this part of the navigation was still functioning, and that therefore people could experience Constable's Flatford as they travelled through it. Next slide. And we have Valley Farmhouse. Again, this is a Constable sketch. This was acquired by the SBAB in 1935. It's less well represented in Constable's art than other buildings in Flatford and East Bergholt, but it was developed, built by a wool merchant in the mid-14th century, substantially rebuilt in the mid-15th century. And SPAB, again, in many ways, sort of vis-a-vis what happened to Flatford Mill. SPAB sort of restored this building, removed the render, opened up the medieval hall, found a solid tread medieval stair, incredibly significant, and beautifully restored it in its late medieval form. That obviously has an aesthetic value, and that aesthetic value indeed sort of builds upon what was it actually intended. There you can see the close studding with the tension bracing, facing the Stour navigation, facing the navigable river as it would have been in the late medieval period. And at the back, you don't have close studding. Of course, it's just like looking at any timber frame house within an urban setting. Okay, next one. And here, famously, we have Willie Lott's house. And again, the house was in such a poor condition by the 1920s. You can see a photograph of it there below. That there was great effort made to try and restore as much fabric as possible, but of course, quite a lot of the timber frame had to be replaced. We just note it's nice to note that the sweet chestnut laths were applied to the timber frame after it was restored or substantially rebuilt, and obviously the render applied with a wood float to give it that sort of undulating look. And it was fated in Helen Allingham's his Cottage Homes of England, written in 1909, as the most typical thing in England. It was already being fated as an icon of the English yeoman spirit. Indeed, poor old Willie Lott, who was very much sort of fated as an icon of the typical English yeoman. He had a very long life. Aesthetic value is notable for how it's therefore has been so sensitively restored. This internal constructional detail, mostly beams, its external finish and fenestration. Great effort was made to retain as much of the original fenestration as possible, but again, quite a lot of restoration, quite a lot of replacement of framing, and it's sometimes quite difficult to sort of disentangle what's 1920s and what might be earlier sometimes, such was the care taken by SPAB, with SPAB's advice. Right, next one. Oh, I'll just go backwards. So let's do a segue to John. So, I mean, what I hope I've shown is just very briefly is that aesthetic value is very much intertwined with the other values, and that when we're looking at somewhere as significant, for example, as Flatford, we perhaps should be mindful of the fact that when we might be placing a very high aesthetic value, when actually sometimes the in order to realize that aesthetic value, there has been quite a lot of change in terms of the actual built fabric, taken back to a time which perhaps would embody or symbolize an ideal of, in this case, the English yeoman house, the lowland house, and of course, this is a time by the 1920s, 1930s, when there's, and Stanley Baldwin's orations, and in part what Churchill imagined as well, was an increasing celebration, what was considered to be lowland England. Following on from the way in which the upland landscapes of northern England had been the focus of Octavia Hill and some of the founders of the National Trust, and of course Wordsworth and others in the later 18th and 19th centuries. That, however, leaves out, those considerations, however, leave out what John is going to be talking about, which again builds on this understanding of the intersection of values. So over to John. Next slide.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeremy. I think I wanted to start off on that kind of contrast and understanding that aesthetic and architectural value is more than about just something looking nice and something looking good. And I felt drawn back to that quote from Richard Hillary around how much he absolutely hated the north of England, although counting the Black Country as the north of England I think might be slightly controversial. But it's around understanding that how the architectural and aesthetic value derives from not just a sense of architectural quality or a sense of what is a good design, but around how that overall impression fits in. So if we move on to the next slide, a lot of the sort of Northern English industrial towns, industrial settlements were built on quite a planned format. So we have ones like in the picture on the right, Barrow in Furness, where we have that very distinctive uniformity in the in the street planning. So you have that very classic layout of rows of terraced houses, very uniform, very even rhythm, chapel at the end, creating a very nice little architectural set piece. None of it is grand high architecture, but it creates a very specific view. And then on top of that, you have the shipyards, and that creates that aesthetic appearance that is purely of that place. And again, that speaks to those historic values, looking at associations with manufacturing. It speaks to some of those evidential values around how these spaces are used. And again, if we look at the image on the left, we have central Newcastle upon Tyne. We have the view from the roof of the castle, looking at the Bridge Hotel, which is itself listed as this example of purpose-built, later Victorian pub and hotel architecture. You've got the high-level bridge, which again is slightly earlier, again very heavily designated for its artistic or for its architectural and engineering value, and those associations with transport and the industries of the north, and then understanding how those go together just to create this completely when you look at that area with the castle, the bridge, the hotel, the castle garth, the surrounding buildings, you have this real mishmash of different styles, different architecture. It creates a very specific aesthetic appearance to that, and a very specific architectural composition that changes as you move around. So it's getting beyond this sense that it's an individual structure and it's an individual quality. It is around the ensemble. And if we move on again, we have this uniformity that we talk about. So you have these terrace rows that are very uniform. These are colliery terraces in South Gosforth in Newcastle, which is now a very desirable area, whereas these were actually built for the colliery workers. And the high shot is view from the top of my old office. I used to work up in that part of town, and you have that very uniform array of houses and the sort of the terraces and some of the later semi-detached houses, and it's a very uniform pattern, and that creates a specific architectural composition. But then when you look at it more closely, you look at how that composition and that architecture has been used to create indicators of status within the pit. So you have these much more ornate bay windows, which create more space and more light within the building, and those are related to the higher status employees, the managers, the overmen and the deputies. And subsequent to that, they have been taken on and adapted to fit a more recent understanding of what higher status buildings should look like. So some of them have been rendered, the gardens have been altered, and various other alterations have been done to reflect that. And then if we move on, really just to wrap up again, picking up on this sense of that contrast between picturesque that Jeremy's been talking about and that sense of aesthetic value of the nice, warm, cozy England, the attractive cottages, and then what people in the past have often considered to be unattractive, detracting, long uniform lines, black with coal dust. These are now things that we would consider as having a degree of architectural interest because of that difference and the historical interest that derives from that and that use. And also remembering that even as these structures being derided as ugly and squalid and unpleasant, we know how people in the past sought to deal with that that perceived ugliness, and how there's always this process of attempt to improve that aesthetic and how that fits into our current understandings. And when we think about how these structures were used and modified, and some of the more ephemeral changes around things like the gardens, and how that would affect our understanding of that aesthetic value. So really it's to finish there for me and return back to Jeremy.